Welcome to Adult Sabbath School Podcast. Please subscribe to the channel, share it with a friend, and write any questions or comments you have below.
Fast forward a few centuries, and the New Testament singles out this one woman, Rahab. It holds her up as this shining example of incredible faith. It's a really powerful endorsement, especially for someone who, by all accounts, was a complete outsider.
So who was this woman, and what did she do that was so remarkable? To really get why her story is so powerful, we first have to understand the absolutely terrifying situation facing everyone in the land of Canaan at that very moment.
Okay, so as the Israelite nation gets ready to enter the land, the people living there, the Canaanites, they're facing an impossible choice. And this wasn't just about losing a war. No, Israel was operating under a divine command known as Herem, or the ban, which was basically a decree to completely devote the cities in their path to destruction. Surrender wasn't really on the table.
And look, this wasn't just battlefield gossip. The stories about Israel's impossible victories and the rumors about the overwhelming power of the God who delivered them from Egypt, these stories were traveling way faster than the army itself. For the people of Canaan, this was a straight-up existential threat, with no obvious diplomatic way out. So here's where the road splits. On one side, you have most of the Canaanite kings doing the predictable thing. They team up, form a big military coalition, and get ready to fight. But one group, the people of Gibeon, they looked at the situation and decided brute force was a losing game. They chose a path of cleverness, but we'll get back to their story in just a minute. First, let's look at an even more unlikely survivor.
All right, let's zoom in now on a single person whose story is, well, even more remarkable. Rahab of Jericho, a woman who chose faith when everyone else was choosing fear. Think about who Rahab was. She was a complete outsider in her own society, a Canaanite woman, labeled a harlot. And yet when two Israelite spies sneak into Jericho, she doesn't just give them a place to stay, she actively lies to her own king's soldiers to protect them. She risked being executed on the spot to help her city's enemies. And she did it to strike a very specific, very powerful kind of deal. Now, you really have to pay attention to the words she uses here. This is so important. She doesn't just ask for mercy, she asks for chesed. This is a huge concept in Hebrew. It's not just be nice to me. It's about covenant loyalty, this binding faithfulness. She was essentially saying, look, I am showing you this binding act of kindness, and I expect an oath that you will show it back to me and my family, a life for a life. It's a legal and moral claim.
And here's the why behind it all. This wasn't just some desperate transaction for survival. This was a flat-out declaration of faith. Just picture it. A Canaanite woman, probably on a rooftop where people usually prayed to pagan gods, declares that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the one true God of heaven and earth. This was a conscious choice to abandon her culture's gods and surrender to his authority. Just wow.
Okay, so you have Rahab's bold act of faith. Now let's contrast that with our second case study, the Gibeonites. They also wanted to survive, but they chose a very, very different method to get their hands on a covenant.
The original Hebrew text here is fascinating. The word used to describe their approach is wonderfully ambiguous. It can mean wise prudence, but it can also mean criminal cunning. And in this case, it was kind of both. Their actions were definitely treacherous, but the intent behind it all was simply to stay alive.
And wow, did they commit to the bit? This was pure theater. They dressed the part with worn-out clothes, they brought props like moldy bread and cracked wineskins, and they spun this elaborate story about being from a country far, far away. The whole goal was to exploit a loophole. Israel was forbidden from making treaties with any of the local nations, but treaties with distant nations, that was okay.
And it worked. Perfectly. The Israelite leaders, Joshua included, they fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. But the text gives us this crucial little note, a detail about why it worked. They relied on the physical evidence, on their own judgment. They never stopped to ask God for guidance. And that mistake would lock them into an oath they couldn't break.
So let's pause here. We've got two groups, and both successfully escaped destruction. But when you put their stories right next to each other, the differences in their approach, and more importantly, their outcomes, are just profound. And this is where the two paths really dramatically diverge. Just look at the core difference in motivation. For Rahab, it was faith. She acknowledged a higher power. For the Gibeonites, it was pure self-preservation.
And you can see how that one difference just cascades down and affects the outcome. I mean, yes, both survive, but Rahab is honored. She's fully integrated into Israel's story. She even becomes an ancestor of its greatest kings. The Gibeonites, they're spared, but they're forever marked by their deception, and they're bound to a life of servitude.
So what's the big takeaway here? What do these two totally different paths to survival actually tell us about the nature of mercy and grace?
Well, in both cases, mercy was shown to people who, by the letter of the law, were destined for destruction. Rahab, the faithful individual, and the Gibeonites, the cunning collective, they were both brought into the community of Israel. It really shows that the door was open, but they had to choose to walk through it by turning away from their old ways.
You know, the source texts hint at this incredible possibility. What if the Gibeonites had just come honestly? What if they had renounced their idols and asked for mercy, just like Rahab did? It's entirely possible they could have received that mercy without the deception and without the servitude that came with it. Their scheme worked, but it might not have been necessary at all.
And really, this principle that mercy is available to all who seek it, no matter their background, is a theme that just echoes throughout the entire biblical narrative. It's this idea of demolishing the walls that divide people and providing free access to grace for anyone who simply turns towards it.
So what do we do with this? Both paths led to survival, right? That much is clear. But the quality of that survival, profoundly different. Faith led to honor, to inclusion, to a legacy. Cunning led to life, but a life of servitude. It really forces us to ask, when the stakes are at their absolute highest, is it better to be clever enough to survive or brave enough to trust?
Thanks for watching. See you next time.